Hi, this is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame educational video series, where we discuss Kenpo principles of motion. We discuss with our seniors in the Kenpo world. And today we are very honored to have two of Ed Parker's senior belts. These gentlemen both have devoted their entire lives to the Kenpo world and have made major contributions to the Kenpo world. And today we're honored to have with us Senior Master of the Arts, Lee Wedlake. Hello, Lee. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Paul.
And also Dennis Knatzer. How you doing, Dennis?
Hey, how are you doing? Good to see you, Paul.
Good. Say hello to Lee.
Hey, Lee, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Dennis. How are you?
Oh, doing great.
Two good friends that have known each other a long time. They have a lot of history, both in competition, also in teaching, and also with seminars with the founding Grandmaster Edmund K. Parker. So we're going to talk about Mr. Wedlake's history. So we're going to educate a few people. And I've known Lee for a long time. Actually, first time I met Mr. Wedlake was in Pasadena. It was right there. I was training under Frank Trejo. Mr. Wedlake came into the school. He was at that time, he was for Chicago. Am I right on that, Lee?
Correct.
That's right. And that was like 79. And to this day, I'm very honored that Mr. Wedlake signed my first degree brown belt as a witness. And I still have that.
Right. I was there. I saw it.
Yeah. And he was also part of the test. And it's actually next month, it'll be 40 years, March the 21st, 1981. We had a testing board of 12 of the most prominent black belts and 17 people testing for promotion. It was in a long, exciting, but very rewarding day, spending time with you gentlemen, and the journey is just beginning today. So let's go back with you, Lee. Forgive me if I have to wear my glasses, age, third kind of thing here. So let's talk about your history, Lee. You grew up where?
On the south side of Chicago.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Bad Leroy Brown there.
All right.
Is that where you got the nickname Uncle Lethal?
No, actually, I picked that up just a few years ago in Tucson, Arizona, from Sean and Rebecca Knight. So what took so long?
Cool. What brought you to the martial arts?
I had started when I was a real young kid. My mother was one of these parents who said, my child or children should have a little experience in a lot of different things. So I was at the YMCA and I did boxing, I did judo, swimming, dance lessons, music lessons, you know, the whole deal. And it was a judo class that I had taken there at the YMCA when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And she thought that I just really loved it. And at the time I did not. I did not have a good instructor. But she said, oh, since you're liking this so much, I'm going to get you signed up in a real judo school. And she sent me down to the Shindo Kan school on the south side of Chicago, where they straightened out what I was doing. I said, hey, this doesn't hurt. This is fun. And that's what really kicked it off. And my first real instructor was a lady named Carol Wolken. Carol just recently passed away. I had reconnected with her after many years. And she was living in Tucson, and I was able to see her during my seminar trips out there, and up until the time that she passed from cancer. So I appreciate that, but I really owe my martial art career to two women. One was my mother, and one was Carol.
How many years did you spend with her?
Probably 4 or 5 years. She was like a second mother to me until we moved out to the suburbs. It was too far away from the studio. And then I dropped out of the judo, picked up again a little bit at the junior college, and then ran into some Kenpo guys, and that was all she wrote.
I see. And so we'll address this later, but how did that influence you later as an instructor in your martial arts journey? Did you ever look back to those principles? Did you ever use that later as a teacher in Kenpo?
I did, for a number of reasons. And you gotta understand, Paul, this was back in the 60s. And Judo was like the first fad martial art. I mean, you've been around long enough to see how it seems like every decade or so there's a new thing. There's judo, there was karate, and then there was kung fu, and then there was the kung fu Bruce Lee phase, and then it went off into the ninjutsu, and then there was Eskrima, and then MMA and BJJ and all that. So judo was the first one made famous by the James Bond movies and so on, and karate kind of came second.
I see. In your trade, and you went after that, you later evolved into Kenpo. Tell us about the Kenpo experience. Now, this is a new foundation for you.
Well, you know, the judo had taught me a lot of the basic physical principles because they're really, as you know, two different things. Judo, wrestling, and so on, you have to make it work. And in Kenpo in particular, it's like you almost kind of have to talk them into it. So if I poke you in the eyes, you're going to react like this. Because if you do everything as it should be on your partner, you run out of partners very quickly. But judo gave me a very good grounding on the physics, the mechanics, the timing, and so on. And really what I thought was most important was the attitude, because back in the 60s, there was a very distinct difference in attitude between judo people and karate people. And back then, the two didn't really mix. And karate people were seen to be very, very egotistical. And judo people had a little more laid back attitude. And when I went back after training in Kenpo for a while, I went back to visit my judo teacher. He said, "You don't have that karate man attitude." Now that's changed since then. I mean, that was a generality back then. But getting into the Kenpo, that was an experience because the first school that I went to, the instructor was not very good. And so
Explain yourself there. What do you mean he was not very good?
Well, you could learn the movements, but if you were to ask, like, what is this for? He'd say, well, it's a kick and a punch. I say, oh, I can see that it's a kick and a punch, but a kick and a punch to where and when and why are we doing this particular sequence? And I overheard instructors in that school, one of them made a comment one day, said, if you threw a left punch at a Kenpo man, he'd freak. And I was 18 years old. I said, that's not right. It can't be right. Why would that be? And they got pretty critical about, well, your cat stance was an inch off, so we're going to fail you on that test. And that didn't happen to me, but it did happen to people. And these are not things that promote growth in the martial arts. I mean, you're supposed to nurture people. Yeah, you've got to make corrections and so on. And that's what they did for me in judo. They said, you know, try it like this, it'll work a little bit better. But this guy he was a hammer, essentially. And when I'd ask him what something was, he'd say, I think it's for this. He really didn't seem to have the depth of knowledge that I really needed. And I could see that from the system of Kenpo that I was learning, that there was a significant difference between what I would later learn to be the Parker material versus other material that had been filtered into the system and made as a requirement, which essentially was a busy work section. Things to keep you paying your tuition and keep you busy and kind of hold you back even.
What was his background then? Who did he train with? Or did he?
He actually trained with Al Tracy in California.
I see. So he was a Tracy black belt.
Yeah, he was a Tracy guy. So I don't try to hide it. I started in the Tracy system like a lot of Parker guys did, and moved away from it after several years.
Interesting. You know, Frank Dennis was started in was it the Tracy system, Dennis?
Yeah, under LeBounty. Yeah.
Okay. What was your comments on I guess the foundation we're looking at is an issue of the instructor trying to convey information to the student to encourage them to grow. Was there a problem with that in the Tracy system?
Well, you know, from my experience, I mean, we did the techniques and stuff, and we did it pretty well. Our form was pretty well, but you know, when I was coming up, it was like, in fact, I learned short three, and I go, "What's this for?" And they go, "Well, don't worry about it. We'll tell you later." You know, and it's like, okay, so I got to be a little bit higher to understand what it was. So you copied that. Well, fast forward ahead to Ed Parker. You know, I was a second degree black belt when I went to Ed Parker, and when I got there, it was, I was a kid in a candy store. He had all the answers to everything. And it was just a joy. And I cold turkeyed what I was doing and switched over directly. So I had to relearn everything so I could teach it because I had a school full of people. And so I had to kind of fast forward on the techniques and everything. But the techniques were, I found a lot of aha moments where I was doing an old technique and I'm going, oh, okay, that's what you're doing here. Man, that works a heck of a lot better. And so, just a lot of those kind of moments. Uh, the material wasn't that far off per se under LeBounty, but there was quite a few little technical points that were, I would say, actually very important. And it was, it just they made a lot more sense, and they were a lot better to do for me. And so I quite enjoyed that. And of course, then I started getting more interested and digging even more because I wanted to learn, more of the stuff to figure out why this was there and that was there. And then he kept throwing stuff out like the web of knowledge and more about the universal pattern. And then then the books came out, and I mean just numerous things.
It's interesting you say that. Mr. Parker never dodged a question. He actually embraced it. And I actually learned more from him in Pasadena, just listening to his conversations. Or if I was fortunate enough to be around him and Frank. Usually if you're at the table breaking bread with Mr. Parker, that's when things would come up, because he wouldn't just want to sit and talk about the news. He'd ask you your thoughts on something, right, Lee?
Right.
Yeah, and then the number one was don't sit across from him.
No.
You're eating. Rule number one, okay? And the nuances were there. I mean, I think he loved the idea of the analytical study of motion. And that is from his background as an educator. I was lucky enough to go to college, so I understand about the Socratic method, asking always with a question rather than a response to produce more responses. And I know that you would probably be thinking along that way. So Lee, so you're training with this man in Chicago in the Kenpo system, and all of a sudden you decide to expand because you're something's lacking. What brought you to Ed Parker Kenpo Karate?
I was a teenager. I was 19, 20 years old maybe, and I'm in this Kenpo school. I'm learning this material, and I'm not getting answers to questions. And I'm finding out by watching, I saw Ed Parker on television on the Dinah Shore show. And I went back to my teacher and I said, I saw him, and I believe it was Larry Tatum that was his dummy for the techniques. So I saw this, and I had heard about him. I knew who he was. I had his first book. And my teacher says, well, he's really not all that good and everything. I said, well, I don't agree. And so I was gathering as much information as I could, and it was harder to get information back then. Occasional magazine article, once in a while you find a book, but it just made me hungry. And by then I was out on the tournament circuit, and I ran into a man who was a Parker black belt out of the Salt Lake City School. I had trained with Mills Crenshaw and was a classmate of Gil Hibbins. His name was Michael Sanders. And when I saw what he did, I was like, oh my God, this does not even look like what we do. And to address what Dennis had said, there was a saying back then, the farther east you went in the United States, the worse the Kenpo got. And Dennis is on the West Coast, or closer to the West Coast. I'm over in Chicago. I'm 2/3 of the way across the country. The Kenpo that I'm learning doesn't have checks, doesn't have any principles. There's no power principles. There's no reasons for things being done. And I knew that there had to be someone who knew an answer to that. And I found Mike Sanders, and he started to fill me in on this sort of thing. And the techniques, as it turned out, the techniques I had learned in the Tracy School, I was able to go back to Mr. Parker years later and say, is this one of yours? Was that one of yours? And he'd say, this one, that one, no, 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 yes, yes, no, no. And I found that the adjustments were just fantastic, made the stuff work a lot better, made a lot more sense. And that's a key principle of learning. If you understand it, you can make it yours. If you don't, you tend to reject it. You're not going to get it.
Being that the case, before you made the trip to come out west, did you ever have a conversation with, say, one of the Tracy founders, Al or Jim?
I had never had the opportunity to meet them. My teacher, my first Kenpo teacher, had broken the connection with them, and really it was very obscure as to what the connection was. And it would be some time later that I found out where he got promoted and how he got promoted, which was kind of shady.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I never did get a chance to talk with the Tracys.
You know, I'm going to bring Dennis in on the conversation now. Dennis, your experience, you did know the Tracys, correct?
I met Al. I didn't
Okay.
Jim or Will.
And what was your opinion of Al?
You know, I never. You know, we talked. I was at the Hall of Fame that he threw in Vegas. You know, one year, and so we didn't talk. You know, very long. Talk about 45 minutes or so. And he was. I mean, obviously knowledgeable about the old days. I mean, he was one of the original. You know, one of the biggies back there in San Jose that you know, started everything. You know, pretty much. LeBounty was his third black belt, as an example. So he was we were early on in the old stuff, and he was a pretty tough guy, from what I understand, and fairly knowledgeable, but he was very business oriented. I think their focus was this. They saw this as a huge opportunity in business. At which case, you know, as I talked to Mr. Parker later on, you know, he said, "Thank God for Al Tracy," because Al was the one that actually spread the system across the world. And then when I was with him, constantly, Mr. Park was getting calls from, like Lee had mentioned earlier, you know, ex-Tracy people that kind of filtered back to, you know, coming back to the Holy Grail, you might say. And so, you know, we all, you know, started, you know, filtering back, and then of course, very few really picked up the yoke and really, you know, went on and really did what he was really into and stayed with him, you know. And a lot of them came in and got what they wanted, and they just wanted to work a business and go on, and that was it. So, but there was a lot of material there and a lot of very interesting stuff going, and a lot of interesting people. You know, I met a lot of interesting Tracy people.
Let's debunk you know, a false statement. And Dennis, personally, and maybe Lee might know this because I haven't spoken to you about it. But Dennis, you were there present when Mr. Parker would have conversation with the Tracys, correct?
I was at his house.
What was their relationship like?
You know, it sounded like me talking to Lee or me talking to you. There was no ill will. There was no fighting and stuff. Which the first time I heard it, you know, he was talking to somebody. I didn't know who it was, and he talked for, I don't know, 15 minutes. It wasn't a real long phone call. And he hangs up and he goes, "Hey, that was your buddy I was just talking to on the phone." And I go, "My buddy? Who's my buddy?" "Hey, you know your buddy, Al Tracy." "Wow, you're talking to Al Tracy? Oh my God, you guys are civil? I thought you guys, you know, were mortal enemies." "Ah, man, Al calls me up maybe every month or so, you know, to talk. We've talked about you for a while. We talk about a lot of my guys." So,
It's hard to take you serious when you use your impression, you know, but it's enjoyable. Thank you. Well, you know what? That tells me there was much more there. And whoever, you know, fans the fires of dissent, which seems to be a common practice in the Kenpo community, I don't get it. It's not a positive message, and it seems like it doesn't have any purpose. So we're going to go on back to Lee, and I want to ask Lee about some questions. So Lee, now good, you get the inspiration to come west. Go west, young man. So you come west, and you end up in Pasadena. Tell us about how it came about you became a student of Ed Parker.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I was been competing. I was on the national circuit. I was a rated competitor in the Midwest, and in those travels, in their national tournaments, I ran into Ed Parker a few times. And at one of the tournaments, I competed. He was the center judge. And my habit after competing at the end of the division was to go up to each judge and say, what could I do better? What did you see? How could I improve my performance? And I would collect that information over time. And I improved from it. And he told me, well, you know, you need to do this and that. And I said, wow, I didn't know what he was talking about. I went back to my teacher and I said, he said something about a general egg-shaped circle or egg-shaped pattern. I said, I don't know what he means. And he said, your stances are too low. Because I was competing in the Midwest where there's a very heavy Okinawan and Japanese influence. And for me to get anywhere in forms competition, I had to drop my stances. Breaking the rules about Parker Kenpo, but I had to do that. And as I eventually got into the Parker system, I raised things up because now they could read what I was doing. It made more sense. My movements were clearer. I got better scores. But I keep running into Ed Parker, and I'm at a big national tournament, and he sees me again, and he says, I want to talk to you. And I was like, Ed Parker wants to talk to me? He says, yeah. He says, come up to the room afterwards, and, you know, and we'll talk. So I go up and say, what in the heck would Ed Parker want to talk to me about? And he says, I need a representative in the Midwest. And then he says, when can you come to Pasadena? And I remember looking at him, I was stunned, and I said, you tell me when you want me there and I'll be there. And it was a little less than 2 months later that I made my first trip to Pasadena in November of '79, which is when I met you and Paul Gerard, Steve Orsino, and John Murillo. You know, the four of you were brown belts.
The first
together.
four, yes, that was we were the first four.
And I took my first private lesson at the Pasadena school with Mr. Parker, and the rest is history.
Wow. Wow. Dennis, how about you? When was the first time you trained with Ed Parker?
Actually trained with him was probably late '78. You know, I had an issue with Gary Swan, who's in San Antonio, who was my instructor at the time, who was a student of the Bounties. We had some differences, and so I didn't agree with him. And so anyway, I got the opportunity to go to Mr. Parker, and so I actually went over with a couple of other guys that were in town here, a couple of friends of mine that were studying with him, and we took a trip to Pasadena and went over there. And of course, I was kind of the low man on the totem pole at that point in time. Those two, Chris Kravonic and Jaime Saenz, had both. Actually, Chris was the student at that time. He was had a school in Glendale, and we had a lesson in the middle of Pasadena school. Of course, we were there, I don't know, for an hour. Parker was late as usual, and you know, as we were out on the floor, you know, I didn't say anything. I was letting Chris kind of talk, which was good. I learned a lot from that because we were doing some technique. I don't know, one of the rams, and you know, you drop down on the knee and they hit the ankle, and Chris goes, I don't think that's going to really hurt the ankle that much. Now, what a dumb thing to say.
Oh,
So
He said that to you, or he said that to Ed Parker?
No, he said that. Chris said that to Mr. Parker.
Oh, okay, big mistake.
So, yeah, Mr. Parker decided to show him. So I'm kind of watching on the side. Of course, everybody else is sitting in chairs on the benches and stuff around the Pasadena school. And they're all chuckling as they're watching Ed Parker beat the crap out of Chris. Yeah. And I'm just kind of watching, going, okay, I know what not to say now, and so I've got to phrase this a little bit different. So Chris had to hobble around for a couple hours, and he wasn't hurt bad, but he got the point, you know, real quick. You know, you have Ed Parker drop his knee on your calf. He didn't even hit him on the ankle. He dropped it on his calf. You know, otherwise he would have broke his ankle, I'm sure. But so it was kind of humorous, actually, and so we just talked stuff. So I learned a little bit there, but really not that much. And so we made the connection there, and we went back to the Vagabond, and you know, we talked about what happened and everything. We sort of kind of giggled with each other, and then we came home. Then I went back. I called Mr. Parker up, and they said, hey, I want to come out. It was maybe a couple of weeks later, maybe. And so I flew out by myself, and that's when, things really started happening. And he asked me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm representing you now in Phoenix. Tell me what I need to do. What's the dues for all the students? What's the patches? And as far as the material goes, I just like to start at the bottom and come up through the stuff." He goes, that stuff. Come on, we need to get some more advanced stuff. And I'm going, well, not really. I brought my little booklet out there, and I said, I'd really like to go through this stuff, the 10 yellow belt techniques and everything. And he kind of begrudgingly appeased me, but it was almost, he was annoyed at going through that. But I figured, well, I better start at the bottom, because I knew that I was doing them kind of quasi right, but I'm sure he could have showed me. I knew they could have showed me more, which is what eventually happened. And he kind of begrudgingly did that, and we just, as we cruised along, that's all we did, was just kind of went through everything, and little by little, every time go over a little bit more, something new, pick up a few more techniques, another form, whatever. And and I'll tell you, some of the lessons were mind-boggling. I mean, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. It kind of looked the same, very close to, but boy, was I missing a lot of real acute, details. So it was interesting. It was a lot of fun.
I got a question for both of you, Jim. And how did you meet one another? We'll start with, go ahead, Dennis, how did you meet Lee? And then Lee, how did you meet Dennis? And you can explain that.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was the trip to England, wasn't it? Lee?
I think we crossed paths at the internationals,
Well, it could have been, yeah.
where I met Brian like in 78 or 77.
Right.
Brian Duffy at the internationals. And I'm sure that I bumped into you either that same year or the year after.
Right.
So we kind of crossed paths back in the late 70s.
Yeah, that could very well be. I mean, I guess I remember the most time was going to England, number one, with you and Skip, and then of course us going with Frank down to Australia,
Right.
and
Yeah.
we spent
yeah,
a
that's
couple
when
of weeks.
we got to know each other a bit more. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I had met you back in the late 70s.
Right.
What was the first lesson, Lee, that Mr. Parker taught you?
Attention stance, down on your horse. And I was like Dennis.
How did that work out for you?
It was fine. I mean, I had a pretty good horse stance, but when he said, "How do you find the dimensions of a horse?" I was like, I don't know. Some people have called me a body mimic over time, and so I could do things, but I knew I was missing the whys to go along with the hows. And so when he started me on that, and it was down on a horse, inward blocks, and those were the details that I needed, because the way I was taught didn't have that. Just didn't have. I couldn't tell you the difference between a hammering block and a thrusting block. And I was a hotshot black belt. I had a lot of trophies for fighting forms and weapons.
You think you were a hot shot, is what you're saying.
Well, other people said I was a hot shot.
Yeah, but you had a little bit of a moment when Mr. Parker started spending time with you.
Absolutely. I said, man, I don't know anything.
Well, when he starts asking questions like, how do you determine a correct neutral bow? Well, I don't know. You step back and you're, I said heel toe alignment, and he goes, no, it's a toe heel alignment. Your front foot's your coordinate, first, and then you go back. And he said, yeah, but then how far back do you go? And I go, well, I don't know, about this far, and like Lee said, there's these little details that he would say, well, you got to go to do a training horse, you go heels, toe heels, then you're out, you got to go a little bit wider than your shoulders or thereabouts, push your knees out, and he had all these dimensions that he would say that were, fit for each individual. And, it's basically the same thing, but each individual had a different width because of his legs and such, so there was a lot of details we were missing, just like,
absolutely, no doubt.
Why do you do this or why do you do that? When you start saying why, it's like, oh man, kind of hate teachers like that, because now I don't know what the heck they're talking about. Talking about the oval. What the hell is an outer rim? I don't know what are you talking about? This egg shaped thing. I like them for breakfast, but
Dennis, you will bring in the humorous side as you always do. So let's
But
get into it. So now, Lee, you're training in Pasadena with Mr. Parker. Did you move to Pasadena at that point, or did you just
I
come out
commuted.
frequently? I'm
I
sorry.
commuted. I was
you
flying
commuted.
from Chicago to California. At first, I was out there like every 3 months or so, and getting to know y'all, as they say, and working, doing the Friday Night Line, and that's how I got to meet all the guys, Yosh Furia and Paul Dye and Ken Johnson,
Yeah.
and all the rest. The Shakey's Pizza on Friday night after class. But I would go to and from, and then Mr. Parker would call me once in a while, say, I'm going to be in Ohio, in Cleveland, on this date. I want you to meet me there. Fine, I'll be there. And then I would fly him out to Chicago. So the meetings were fairly frequent in those first several years. And then as my circle of friends expanded, I started to fly Frank out to Chicago. And then Joe Palazzo came out a couple of times, and it built from there.
Question for you on Friday nights when we went to Shakey's. Was it beer or was it root beer for you?
No, it was beer.
There's a few that had the root beer. Fudd and Bud and Yosh and Roger. I really miss Roger. I was talking to him the last 6 years of his life, and it was always very informative as well as educational. He was obviously Mr. Parker's attorney, and so we would have discussions regarding the law, constitutional law and stuff. I was a graduate of law school with 5 firms. So it was always fun talking to him about his opinions on things. But what a great man. I always enjoyed watching him on Friday nights run the class.
Yeah. He'd run those techniques and he'd laugh as he was doing them.
Yeah, and it was always interesting who showed up on a Friday night. You never know who would be there. I mean, people show up. By the way, I have a question for you. In 81, as I mentioned earlier, we tested, there was one gentleman that was on the board, and I believe he was a Hispanic man. I'm not sure who he was. Do you know what I'm talking about? I think he was from Mexico or something.
I think he was from Spain.
Was he Spain? Okay.
I think so. And he had come over. He wanted to do what a lot of us did, which was to learn the system. And I remember that he went back, and then he showed up on the front of a martial arts magazine, and it was presented as if he was the maestro. And I remember Frank showing me this. He held up the magazine and pointed at the guy's face and made a face like, this guy?
There was an interesting conversation I had with Paul Dye a couple years back. And he told me what went on in the meeting inside Mr. Parker's office with all you gentlemen there after the test. I'll leave it alone, but it was very interesting about that conversation with that man and a few other people. So we'll leave it at that. I know you know what I'm talking about. So we're getting now into, so now you're training with Mr. Parker on an ongoing process, and you're going through the system. And are you still competing in tournaments at that point?
I was, I think the last tournament I actually competed in was, the last internationals I went to was 1988, and then I went again in 93.
Okay.
And 93 was the last time I had actually competed. But by 1980, I had already made the national top 10, according to Karate Illustrated magazine. And I had already been rated in Region 7 for several years. So I was I had peaked out already, and had shifted over more to being, I was the player coach at that time, and then I was becoming more of a coach and not competing as much.
You're taking your information, your experience, your training, and now trying to convey that as an instructor for your students.
Not just for my students, but I knew that what I had learned from Ed Parker and a lot of the other senior instructors there is that this is great stuff. More people need to know this. And I had a bit of a background in journalism, having written for the high school newspaper and that sort of thing. So I decided to start writing, and I started to write the magazine articles that I became known for that were first published in the 80s in Inside Kung Fu Magazine and Karate Illustrated and Black Belt and so on. And I would take those, and before anything was ever published, before it was submitted, everything was run by Ed Parker. And he would say, yes, this is good. I remember him saying once, you got the skeleton of the idea, but you're missing some bones. But that was a good learning experience for me as well, because it would fill in those gaps, and then I could transmit that information out to the general public, and Kenpo people in particular.
In talking to you, I can tell right away that the most important thing for you is personal challenge to yourself, to better yourself, which we'll address later as a teacher. What was your greatest accomplishment in the competition world?
Oh boy. I think that being rated in the national top 10, because that took an awful lot of time, energy, and money, practice hours, and so on. And to be on that same list with people like Ernie Reyes and so on, George Chung, that was a big deal for me.
What is it to be, I was addressing this earlier with Mike Stone and a few others, the mindset of a champion. How does one develop his mindset so that he can be a champion, not only on the mat, but in life?
That's, boy, that's a couple hours in itself, Paul.
Just, you can, well, we're not going to follow Dennis down the rabbit hole on that one, okay? I love you, Dennis. You know that. But, just briefly, is there some kind of, example that you can use, your personal experience?
Well, you gotta wanna, and you've got to have the discipline to follow through on this. You got to have some smarts about how you're going to train yourself. And you have to also realize that some things are just beyond your control. And like they say, you don't, they say you don't win, or you don't learn something when you win. I debate that, but there is a lot of value to losing.
I agree with you on that. Positive of affirmation is much more important to understand negative affirmations and correction. So I use that policy. I mean, I've used that with animals that I've owned. I never really owned them. They were shared their life with me. And now with my little guy. And I always give him an affirmation rather than say, don't do this, don't do that, which Mike Stone talked about that. We're given the gift of fear. We're told never to do things, but fearing that we may do it rather than to reach out. Dennis, you're a teacher. How do you convey to your students the correct mindset so they can be champions in their life?
Well, I think Lee hit a great starting point, which is, number one, you have to have desire, to achieve. Just getting by, mediocrity, it is everywhere. You have to want to be above mediocrity. Anybody can be mediocre. So they have to desire it. And if they don't have the desire, either you pick it up and start desiring it, which then leads to practice hours. And so how do I get good at this and accomplish my desire? Well, you desire it. Now you got to figure out what you got to do to work to achieve the goal that you're working for, whether it be a tournament or whether it be a belt or, knowledge in the system, whatever. And then you got to just pursue that.
Do either you gentlemen, when you're observing students or non-students, do you try to inject some kind of positive affirmation in assisting them? I mean, obviously, Lee, you did that after competition. You would go up to the judges and ask them, how could I better myself? But that was self-motivation. How do you, either you can respond to this, help another that may not be able to see that?
I would approach somebody and tell them, like, you know what, you did a great job on this. And what I can tell you is that you can make it even better if you do this. I've got a student named Ray Kellison out of Missouri who won the World Championships, 2 gold medals in the World Championships in 2019. And Ray recently did a presentation on how he became the champion. And he said he had an acronym. And what this acronym was that he used for training was, what would Mr. Wedlake do? And so the lessons that I had passed down to him, he is able to pass down to his competition team. So I think I've had a degree of success with this positive reinforcement instead of saying, you know, beating you with a stick.
Dennis, your response?
Yeah, I echo that too. I mean, I sit there and say, let's say, you know, for example, hey, great, Joe, you know, that's awesome. You know, if you, even if you didn't win, say, look, you didn't win, but you know what, you did a great job. What we need to do is we need to work more on your stances and go back there and just put a little more attention to that. But your focus was good, your sharpness was good. So we got a lot of little details. We got to, as Mr. Parker would say, we got to spit shine you a little bit,
Right.
and you know, do a little more there. But I think you know, positive is, and I picked this up from Bob White too. Bob White's a very a positive coach. He doesn't like to say don't do this or don't do that, or you didn't do that very good. You know, usually it's more of, okay, we need to improve on this. Instead of saying that wasn't very good, he'd say, we need to improve on your kicking. You know, let's next lesson we're going to work on that a little bit more. It's more of the positive affirmation of, you know, do it versus the negative training. Like I can't tell you, you know, when I was coming up, it was the when the Shinai came out. Oh boy.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
You guys
So-
are, it must be an inside joke.
No, we just got didn't you get your stance low enough, you know, all of a sudden here comes a Shinai, you know, this bamboo sword, and whack, you know, you're getting slammed on the legs. You know, it's amazing how good your stance gets, you know, almost immediately when
Oh,
that
yeah.
stick comes out.
My dad
Yeah,
called that a shillelagh.
Well, that was a solid thing. Oh my God, you know. That
I will
stick was
say this
solid.
much: it's obvious that both of you gentlemen, you know, you both have the same characteristic, which is a very positive affirmation. We mentioned this earlier. I had to pull this out. Lee, this piece of paper here is almost 42 years old.
Oh boy.
And if you look over here, barely, you'll see on this end, look who's in there. It's you.
It looks like Lee Wedlake Jr.
It is. It has it. This is really old, man. It's got Mr. Parker, Kelly, Daniel Redarde, Leilani, Frank, and Lee Wedlake on here.
That's funny.
It is nice. You can't read the rest because it's faded out. But I just thought I'd share that with you from way back when, and that was really one of my most proudest moments to have that. I was honored. I wanted to share that with you. That's how long I've known you, a long time. So let's go on to the educational side. So you both are training with Ed Parker, obviously. And is there any other third-party influences during this time? You're both now with Ed Parker, mind you. But is there anybody else that you've looked at or you know, took maybe a lesson or two from? It could have been verbally, could have been something visually that might have influenced you where you are today.
Yes, absolutely. Being a seeker of knowledge, I was training with Ed Parker and learning tons and tons from him. But I had also taken some small group lessons with Danny Inosano a couple of times and some seminars. It was very interesting to get to talk to him because he would tell me his Ed Parker stories. And then there were seminars with people like Benny the Jet. Bill Wallace and I worked. I fought Bill a couple of times. And Joe Lewis. Leo Gahi from the Pakiti Tertius system. So as it was, I started dabbling in these other arts. And I say dabble. And some of them I stuck around long enough that I was certified as an instructor. I have instructor certificates in several martial arts and other disciplines outside the martial arts, but they all contribute to the learning process and how you learn and how you teach. And I can apply that to what I teach with the Parker system. But I'd have to go and say, yes, I did fencing, I did Jeet Kune Do, I did Wing Chun, I did Eskrima, probably more than any of those others. I did Russian Sistema, I did Chinese martial arts, and I did Tai Chi.
Did you also refer back to your judo training?
Yes, because one of the first things I remember learning in judo was the 8 directions that you can unbalance somebody, and that is the middle of the Ed Parker patch with the gun sight.
Explain that to our viewers.
Well, you know, the IKKA crest, which is commonly called the Parker patch, has that circle with the 8 dividing lines in it. And when I was in a judo school as a child, they said, well, there are 8 directions that you need to be familiar with in order that you can execute a throw or prevent from being thrown. Then they outlined the 12, 6, 3, 9, and the diagonal lines too. I said, oh, okay. And then they would break down the techniques of throwing and say, this is how you use the kazushi or the balance breaking in order to execute the throw. Well, then as years go by and I get to Kenpo, there's no mention of that in the Tracy school, but when I get to Ed Parker, it's like, it's right in the middle of the patch. And he said, you know, you got to have those 8 basic lines, and that's the root of the universal pattern.
Dennis, how did Mr. Parker introduce you to the universal patch?
Well, I had known about it for a long time, but I brought him out to my school for a seminar just prior to me actually becoming a student of his, and I had a universal pattern on the wall, and we had done the seminar was finished, and then we were waiting for another black belt, one of Harvey Clary's black belts, Tom Riskus, to come by, and he was going to take Mr. Parker out to lunch. So he's kind of walking around my school, looking at this and that and the other, and some of the weapons I had on the wall. And then he came to the universal pattern, and he says, "You know what this is?" And I go, "Well, yeah, Mr. Parker, that's a universal pattern. Everybody knows what that is." And he goes, "Well, you see these lines on here? You see how this heart is on here?" And he outlines the heart on there, which happened to be kind of going diagonally. And he says, and I said, "Yeah, okay, I see the heart there." And he goes, "Well, you know, the way the patch should be, you should have the patch like this, so the heart is up. Otherwise, this is kind of symbolic that your heart is dead, or you know, your heart's laying on its side." And I'm going, "Oh, okay. Well, I never really noticed the heart before. I had I seen all these lines and circles and everything else, but I really wasn't really into all the really what this whole thing really did." So anyway, Tom Riskus comes by and picks him up. I immediately, as soon as they left, I run in my back room, get out my drill, and turn the thing around and drill that hole. And man, I turned that thing up so the heart's up. You know, so that was my initial lesson with the universal pattern, and then of course it got much deeper than that with time.
Yeah, there's a funny story, a secret, so to speak. And I'm going to ask Mr. Wedlake to talk about it. I mean, Mr. Parker's patch, and you have the 8 lines in there. However, there's one missing. Why is that, Lee?
Well, that's a secret, Paul. I remember discussing that or hearing a discussion about that. Several of us were standing around, and somebody said, "Well, you know, that guy's patch has got the 8 lines. That guy's patch has only got the 7." And then somebody said, "Well, you know why the one is not there? It's because the master always hides something, never teaches everything." I went, "Well, that's kind of interesting." And you could see it, like this guy's patch had 8 and that guy's patch had 7. So I went back to Mr. Parker because I had to ask. And I told him about this conversation. He started to laugh. He said, "It's simple. The patch maker made a mistake."
Interesting. You know, it's funny. Let's talk about patches. One of the things that I think is really interesting about in the patches is your patch. And you use a reference, that Latin phrase that, you know, from Michelangelo. Can you talk about that? And why did you use that phrase in the development of your patch?
I use that phrase, you know, because it's the original Latin that was attributed to him. and I say attributed because they're not 100% positive that he's the one that said it. He can't be the only one who did. But I use it because our art is based in an Asian art, but it's been Americanized. And myself, my family comes from Europe. So we have a European background. And I thought it was appropriate that since I have the European crest overlaid on a universal pattern with the animals from the Orient, that Latin phrase would be appropriate for that. And it would make people ask, what does that mean?
Absolutely. And your response is?
My response is because one of the things that's been told to me over the years is, you are an example of a person who inspires because you keep learning, you take up new challenges, and you accomplish. And I take that, as being a role model very seriously. And
So I'm sorry, go ahead. I started.
I appreciate those comments when they tell me that now.
Well, it's obvious there was a concept that I think paraphrasing, but I think Mr. Parker said something like, or the vigilant instructor is always the ever vigilant student. Correct? Okay, so now we're into your developing your knowledge, your experience, and now you are also the founder of the progressive Kenpo systems. Tell us about that.
I'm not the founder. I was one of the founders.
Okay.
There were a group of us that had met. We were at a seminar over in Europe, and this actually started in Ingmar Johansson's backyard in Norrköping, Sweden. And several of us had sat down. We were discussing techniques. And you know how Kenpo people like to argue about the techniques. And what was nice about it is, like, Eddie Downey got up and he did his version of a technique, and then somebody did their version of the technique, and nobody was tearing each other down. And when we came away from this, he said, that was nice to see. Everybody had some pretty different variations of application out of the same pattern. And myself and Ingmar and Gary Ellis and Graham Lelliott decided that we would put this thing together, and we called it the Progressive Kenpo System, because progressive, meaning it's always moving forward, it's Kenpo, and there's systems, because everybody's got a little bit different way that they do it. Ingmar pulled away not too long after that, but the rest of us have hung together for 20 some odd years now. And it's a very loose association, but they like to call me the lineage head.
Beautiful. And earlier you had mentioned something about that of being a student of Kenpo and such, and learning from all these other people influences. And you also mentioned you were writing. Now you are writing for, I'm guessing, martial arts magazines.
Primarily, yes. I had articles published by magazines and other disciplines as well, but I'm better known in our community for what I wrote for the sport karate magazines and black belt.
That led you to being an author, period, correct?
That contributed greatly, because I had written all these articles, and I talked with Unique Publications when they were still in business down there in Hollywood, publishing Inside Kung Fu and Fighting Stars and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, yeah, if you put your stuff together, we'll publish a book. And I said, great. And they had my manuscript, and they said, well, we'd like to buy the manuscript and we'll publish it, but it'll take 3 years. And I remember saying, that's too long. And I took it back. And it would be almost 20 years before I actually broke that out and published the book and started my series with Kenpo Karate 101.
Yes, and I have that with me. I want to share that with our viewers. The beautiful thing about it is that we can have conversations with Mr. Wedlake or Mr. Knatzer, or if you had the chance to spend some time with Mr. Parker, but that is just a moment. And those probably are what I would call perfect Kenpo moments. But you need to also go back and to revisit those conversations. And unless you were a stenographer or you had a recording machine to record it, you're going on memory. And as time passes by, I think we start to filter out things in our life because we only have so much room. But the beautiful thing is that Mr. Wedlake has this series, and I want to share it with everybody. There's your first book, that you have here, which is brilliant. And I'll let you talk about that in a second, Lee. It's notes for the new student and the seasonal instructor. I like that. The new student and the seasonal instructor, which could be interchangeable if you think about it, because boy, you can go in here and you read it one day and come back, you learn something else. Then you have obviously Kenpo 201, 301, 401, look at that, 501, 601. I'm waiting for the next one to come out. I don't know when that will be. But the wonderful thing in this book that really is an asset to the reader, and I'll have you explain that, is the sorry, gotta put the glasses on. Footwork notation system. Really a great concept, because what it does, it really will assist somebody how to understand what you're trying to convey. The universal signs that we see for stop, like green, yellow, red, things like that, directional, helps us. And what you're doing here is for somebody that may not really be able to understand the reading of English, they'll still be able to understand what you're writing here. The true actual international language, that I am aware of, is called music. The dots on that piece of paper, I don't care if you're in Japan, Germany, Spain, or here in America, it's still a quarter note, an eighth note, a rest, a signature time. It lays it out so you can explain it. So this follows along that, which was a very good idea, and it's innovative, because I've never seen a book that really shows that. So why don't you walk us through a little bit, you can gloss over this if you like, a little bit about Kenpo Karate 101 and how that came to be.
That was, it was kind of interesting, because it was what I had taken as the original concept, was to gather all my articles and put them into one book. And that would become my second book, which was called Further Insights into Kenpo. And I sat down one day and I was thinking, and I started to write, and it took me 6 weeks to write Kenpo 101. And then the editing, I had a friend who was an English teacher, and she read it. And she said, "This is kind of a train wreck. Let's go through this again." So I have to thank her and I do thank her in the book for all that. But I thought there's so many things that people have asked me over time, and my own observations, I wanted to put them together into that book. And that's why I call it Notes for the New Student, because they all ask very similar questions, and those can be answered. And then the seasoned instructor, because sometimes you get some people that are not seasoned instructors. Sometimes I look back in horror that I had the nerve to open a karate school when I was 22 years old. And
well, we're glad you did. So it wouldn't be this conversation right now, Lee.
I was a flight instructor for years. And one thing that came up during that is they said the majority of flight instruction is done by new flight instructors. It's not the guys with all the hours. And I said, they're right. And that's what happens in a lot of karate schools too. In some schools, it's the orange belts are teaching the yellow belts. And other schools, it's the brown belts are teaching a lot of the classes. So you really do need those seasoned instructors out there to put some balance into all that, how to get the information out there in bite-sized chunks that are understandable, and to deliver those messages on, if you want to call it spirituality, ethics, morality, and things that go along with that, because you're a little bit older and you've got life experiences under your belt. So Kenpo 101 was really that was the concept. And I picked up the number series because much like a college course, as you're familiar with, you get up through you got English 101, and then you've got algebra, and you get up into your 401 pro seminar series, constitutional law, and so on. I got my degree in criminal justice, so we have a little bit of a commonality there.
I had that actually myself. My associate arts degree was in criminal justice. I was going to be a policeman, but they had a hiring freeze on, so that never happened.
Got it.
I instead became a criminal. I hung out with Frank Trejo. That's a joke. That's a joke, everybody.
So I wrote the book series, and you said you didn't know when the next one was coming out. Well, what happened was that series that you have there is out of print. And 201, the 1 forms through 6 and beyond are all consolidated now into a book that was published in 2017 by a subsidiary of Random House called Blue Snake Books. It's called the Kenpo Karate Compendium. And that was what the original concept was for my books, was for everything to be in 1 volume. And when I talked with the guys, they said, you know, we really like something written, but something that will fit inside of a gi, because that's how we work. It's like we're going along, we go, okay, and then we pull that thing out and look at it again, and a big book wouldn't work for that. So I broke it into small volumes, and then as years went by, it became 1 big volume. And to go back to the footwork pattern or diagrams, that was taken from my experience as an aerobatic pilot. It's based on the Arresti system.
Beautiful, because it really fits well with the educational side of your background. You're improving yourself, which helps the students to improve themselves, and you're learning from them. You know, we got the thing is with Dennis, we need to have Dennis write that book. And I suggested a title here. You guys need to collaborate on it. I think it should be called Beyond Infinite Insights. Beyond Infinite Insights. I think you guys could address that, because both of you spent the last 12 years of Mr. Parker's life with him, many times either through personal instruction, seminars, and things like that. Those books of Ed Parker, which I have here, you know, and they're very worn, as you can see. I've gone through that with Dennis many times, mental stimulation with the 8 considerations, and then we look at all the other ones. Some of my favorites, you know, the web of knowledge, the analytical study of motion, you know, things like that. It's amazing that these books have been out for so long, but when you address that with the community, most of them say, well, I may own it, or I don't own it, or I don't really understand it, but it's just part of it. And I would think that really flies in the face of Ed Parker, American Kenpo, because he's sitting there telling you exactly what you need to know. And correct me, both of you, on this. I've really delved into this a lot seriously for the last year with Dennis. And so it's really been insightful. But my takeaway from it was, I think that when Parker started, there was the base Kenpo that he had, and then he evolved it, okay? And he started to think about it, and they developed the system that came about, which I came up in the 32 techniques per belt, okay, from orange up to green, and then they added the 10 yellow belt techniques. And all we had as a forms were obviously short 1 through 6, the bow set, you know, the staff set, and we never got past that. Frank was more into drills, into actual fighting, and how to fuse American Kenpo and boxing principles and show you how you could evolve and how you could use those. And they're just, to borrow a line from Dennis, drills to improve your skills. That's something he always shares with me. So I think Parker was going back to simplification. If you look at the books, you start reading it, he got more into the theory in his personal opinion. It wasn't hard and fast like it was with going into the school, and maybe you have to learn all these techniques. And I found, watching a lot of people that do that, they're sort of always forcing that round peg into the square hole. And it needs people like you gentlemen to explain to them the purpose of it. What are your thoughts on Mr. Parker's Infinite Insights, Lee?
Well, back when they came out, he said, you know, you got to buy 2, one for the shelf and one that you're going to just read until it falls apart.
You, Dennis?
Yeah, well, when I first saw the Infinite Insights, or what became the Infinite Insights, it was actually one giant folder, and it was going to be 1 book since '78. And then as he got closer to actually putting the book together in '81, he decided in between there to start, you know, there was too much material there, number one, to put together and then edit and all that kind of thing. So he put together a quick book, or the first book, on what is an introduction basically to the rest of the book. and he started that, and then by the time it was 1981, he put that out. So then he got the idea, instead of doing that, I'm going to put out a series of books, and it eventually turned out to be 5. And so it was interesting that the manuscript that he had in the main file, the full one, was different than the 5 books that came out. As he went along and started doing each book, he actually again expanded those as he wrote those down, and he compiled, say, book 1, and he put out a little more detail than he actually had in the original manuscript, and it's so on and so forth with 2, 3, 4, and of course 5, and each one was on a little bit different subject. So he split them up, and he thought that would be, a better way for people. Like, there's no way to digest a huge volume with that kind of material, so he'd rather do it this way, and I think it was a bright move.
Interesting thing that Dennis likes to bring up a lot, Lee, is the 3 points of view. The 3 points of view, which is really insightful, because most of the time we're too concerned with our own view and not thinking about the other possibilities. You got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I brought that up in seminars, and I like to say, me, it's all about me. And it's not, of course, it's you, it's that opponent, and it's that third person who's watching what's going on. And you know what they say about, there's my story, your story, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where tournaments are a great place to see this. You watch these two people fighting, and you're sitting in the stands going, how come they can't see that? How come they didn't see that point scored? It's because that third person perspective, when you take it and you back it out, is so important, and you can learn a lot from that. And I was up sitting in the stands at the internationals one year, and I was just all by myself watching the action. And then somebody sits down next to me. I look over, and it's Ed Parker. And I was like, geez, sir, what are you doing here? He says, I like to watch what's going on. I like to get that perspective. And so we sat there and we talked, and we watched some of the competition. And I remember him cringing about something that he saw. I said, what's up? And he said, well, you shouldn't do that because of this. I was like, that was a lesson all in itself, just sitting up there in the stands and watching from that third person perspective.
While you're on the subject, what was the greatest lesson Ed Parker taught you?
I think what immediately comes to mind is how to treat people, because he was genuinely a prince. If the Hawaiian monarchy had still existed, he would have been a prince. And he had that ability to make everybody feel comfortable when he wanted to, which was most of the time. Mm-hmm. But he taught me, how to work with people and how to be respectful.
Dennis, what was the greatest lesson that Mr. Parker taught you? You can elaborate on that too.
I would echo. I would echo what Lee said. He would remember pretty much everybody's name. You could you remember some, be introduced to somebody, and then you run into him a year later, and he would, oddly enough, remember their name almost every time. Very few times did he not. But he was, psychology and sociology as his majors in college, I think, really helped him to achieve, dealing with people. And I think he knew that was going to be his lot in life, was dealing with people. And those two things were very important, just like what Lee said. But, beyond that, for me, it was, he kind of kept, I guess the thing that I would pull away from was the desire to constantly look for more. Don't be satisfied with what you see here. There might be something else hidden in that, in which case, he's got sayings that in motion, oftentimes there's motion overlooked. And so you could apply that to everything. In Kenpo, there's oftentimes things that are, in Kenpo that are overlooked. And in life, the same thing holds true. So I think that was probably his most what in my opinion, was more of the digging of continual learning and continual knowledge. Nobody knows everything, I have a saying: each of us needs all of us, and so we both need each other, instructors and students. And a lot of people think that all you need is me, the instructor. I'm the big guy. That's all that's there. Well, without any students, there is no big guy. There is no number one. There is no nothing. You're nobody, without other people.
I'm going to quote Lee on a few things here. And when he said about being a teacher and how he would try to influence other people. And this is from another interview you had, Mr. Wedlake. And it says, you need to live your dreams to achieve your goals. And the ultimate thing from that is to be a good person. I thought that was a very influential statement. It was, why you are a teacher. What's the most difficult thing you've ever had to do as a teacher?
Ooh. I'd have to say telling somebody is like, you know what, I don't think this is for you. Because I really don't want to give up on somebody. But one of the things I learned in other venues and instructing is that sometimes you're just not the person to be teaching that particular person. And you have to have enough wisdom to say, yeah, I think you need to go train with Paul. Paul may be better suited for your personality or his teaching methodology or something like that. I think there was a point in time, it's like, I wanted to be all things to all people. I wanted to know everything. I said, you learn fairly rapidly that's not going to happen. And one of my goals is for people to achieve their goals. I want them to get what they want. And if I can't do it for them, it's like, that's really hard. It was hard to tell. It's like, I don't think I can do that for you. But
I think that's your moral fiber, though, that has to deal with the fact that you're strong on that. You're not going to compromise. But on the other hand, you're never going to quit. And that's truly the mindset of a champion.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really interesting, not only are you an author, but you also have a video series. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Back in 2009, I started putting the material on video, and we've gone through several variations of that. We just recently moved over to the Vimeo platform, and I broke it up into 2 tiers, kind of like what I did, similar to what I did with the books, but there's a section that's for beginners and intermediates, and then there's one for the advanced instructors, and actually on instructing, because as we discussed earlier, you have to learn how to be a teacher. You have to learn how to learn. So you have to learn to be a student and learn how to be a teacher. And I wanted to be able to facilitate that for martial art instructors, because a lot of it is monkey see, monkey do. And that doesn't always work. So you need to know how people's minds work and how they absorb information and how they will integrate this into their being in order for them to do what you're asking them to do and what they want to do.
There was 2 things I noticed on your videos. One was you approached something that you were taught from a previous instructor called the Bujin Kenpo techniques. Yeah. You want to briefly just talk about that? This will maybe ask our viewers to go into your website to find this information.
Mike Sanders was the instructor that I had found that had studied under Mills Crenshaw. And Mike was a remarkable martial artist who died way too soon. And he had a black belt in 7 different systems. And I know this for 2 reasons. One is I saw the paper, and 2 is I felt the hands and the feet. He was very good at what he did. And he was putting together a system that he called Bujin Kenpo, which was basically the warrior's way of the fist. And it was a system that was never finished. Kind of like the Parker system. I just marvel at what Ed Parker did, and I wonder where it would have gone had he lived these subsequent 30 years. But Mike's thing is that it was an interesting system based on a lot on street ability, based on the Parker system.
The other thing that you address, which in your teaching, which is so paramount to our martial arts education, is the the system or the style of Tai Chi? Why is that relevant to our Kenpoists today?
You know, people like to make fun of Tai Chi because they don't understand it, and that's a human thing. They like to either fear or make fun of something they don't understand, and say, well, it's all done in slow motion. I was like, well, so is Kenpo. When you learn it in slow motion. And then you speed it up. Well, the Tai Chi people do that too, but they do it slowly so you have time to really feel the movements, make the corrections, and integrate it, and you can feel the mistakes being made rather than going at speed where you kind of gloss over it, you may miss it. So the Tai Chi is important, I think, because it's another approach. It's the yin to the yang sort of an idea. And it suits the person who wants to do it more for health and fitness, because you can do Tai Chi combatively. I've met some excellent Tai Chi fighters. They're kind of rare, but they're out there, and they have a lot of similar principles that people don't understand. Because one of the phrases I've heard a Kenpo instructor say is, "We are the only people who," then fill in the blank, and that's just not so. Where we have tailoring and proportion to our stances, they have something called the body ruler. So there's these similarities that come across, and you say, well, you know, that's the same. It's a different phrase, but it's the same. And you start to see what we call these golden threads that run between the arts, things that are so important, like stand up straight, relax, breathe, and move. Those 4 principles that everybody does.
You find that you draw a comparison to studying Tai Chi and yoga, which is obviously people in yoga, as you brought forth in your comments, was non-combative. Is that why some people dismiss Tai Chi? They think it's similar?
I think so. I mean, they don't understand it. And there's a lot of very interesting cultural aspects that go along with it. But, you know, at first they say, well, it's not fast, so it can't be used combatively. But I mean, it's slow motion Kung Fu, really. Mm-hmm. And yoga is purely I shouldn't say purely. Yoga is a system that articulates the joints and muscles and so on. And it's more for health and fitness. And Tai Chi certainly, actually, according to my Tai Chi teacher, if you say you do Tai Chi, you're doing it for health and fitness. If you do Tai Chi Chuan, you're doing the fist arts. So there is that subdivision.
You're a big advocate and proponent for getting it right with forms. And obviously your books relate to that. What are the biggest problems you find in people that do Kenpo forms?
I see things on the web that sometimes I want to gouge my own eyeballs out.
Well, don't do that.
The footwork is sloppy. You know, what that tells me, Dennis, you know Ray McCallum. He was one of the best fighters in American karate back in the blood and guts era and all that. Ray McCallum is an excellent Korean stylist. And we were on a board, a black belt test down at Brian Duffy School in Austin, Texas, a couple of years ago. And I had made a statement about, you know, if you can't hit an attention stance, that's the first thing that you learn when you come in the door. And you're telling me that after all this training, you can't bring your feet all the way together and you can't get your fingers together or to touch your sides like they should. So your consciousness is not getting all the way down to your extremities. And I think that's one of the most important points, is that when I watch people doing forms, it's like they've kind of got the idea, but it hasn't made it all the way.
Well, that's a point you brought up in your Tai Chi video of letting the flow all the way down to your ankles. And that when you begin it, you start with the ankles and you move it out. It will make the knees bend and etc. Am I correct?
Yes.
Dennis, your thoughts on the forms? What is the big problems here?
Well, you know, in going back to Raymond has been known as a huge fighter. I don't think I've watched him do a form on rare occasions when we asked him to do one in the studio, and Brian's usually down in Austin. However, he's well known, and he's was a super champion. Him and Troy Dorsey out of Texas were probably two of the greatest, fighters that ever came out of there. But oddly enough, here we are at a test, or in a seminar, and Raymond's there and he's calling everybody to attention, and he's sitting there correcting people on the attention stance. I think that's what Lee was getting at, was Raymond won't even go any farther unless your toes are touching your toes and your heels are touching your heels. There's no split foot, space in between, or anything else. He's very particular and meticulous about that. And I found that when I first heard him do that, I'm going, wow, this guy's known as a fighter. Fighters usually don't care about their, precise foot positions on an attention stance. And so that just goes back to show you what his roots and basics were. And he wanted you to put your feet together. Otherwise, he's not even going to look at you. He'll fail you on a test if you can't do an attention stance. And I found that real odd with that. But just a point on Raymond, and to his credit, he's there's more than meets the eye there. He's more than just a fighter. He's also a very good teacher, and he's a good technician as well. So that was a bit on that.
Recently, I saw a discussion about Mr. Parker's salutations. How many salutations are there in Kenpo? That's an open question to both of you gentlemen. You spent the time with Mr. Parker. I think you're going to set me straight on this one. Go ahead.
We were clowning with the salutations, and Dennis and I were talking about it one day, and it was just, if we would go out and play, Mr. Parker wanted to be one of the guys too, and he would sometimes do things that we were doing just because it was fun. And he would throw something out there, and then people would go, oh my God, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's just, he was having fun too. So as far as the number of salutations, who knows? I mean, we've all seen the difference in the hand positions.
Yeah.
Dennis, what do you think, Dennis?
Well, how many are there, Dennis?
The numbers vary like the stars, and the correct ones are, more like the moon. There's only one, but it's amazing. I mean, I see people start the forms, like say short form 1, and they start with the signaling using the bent finger to illustrate short 1, and they'll start it on the right side with the right palm open and the left finger on it. Then they'll go to the left, and then they'll come across, and you can do it that way, and you can make it look really cool. But the way Mr. Parker did it was he signaled on the left side first, and then the right side, because from the right side you come up and then you step forward, going out to the old Chinese salutation where you advance to the cat stance and then you roll back. So it really technically should start on the left and go on the right. Oddly enough, in book 5, when Lee was the model for the forms, apparently back in those days when the layout was all cut and paste type stuff,
Right.
apparently that those characters got put on in reverse, and there was the right side hand actually in the first position. So I don't know if Charlie Gonzalez put them back on incorrectly or who it was that did it. Anyway, it came out, and a lot of people said, well, it's in book 5. And then you go, well, yeah, but that's really, and so, then you look like an idiot, because it's like, oh, okay, Dennis is being an idiot. He thinks he knows it all.
No. I think that's important because it is in book 5, starting on page 14. And then that begins, it talks through that. And no, it was brought up, there's like, I was recently said there's 4 different salutations. And I thought, wow, okay.
Well, when I first learned them, there was no signaling or anything. It was just you stepped out into a horse stance, and then you started short form 1. That was it.
Right.
And then we started getting these signaling things and all that, and which was quite interesting. Huck Planis kind of informed me that we started signaling back when there was a referee on each corner and one in the center, and you did a signal over here to show this guy back to your rear left shoulder the number, and then the guys in front can see it, and then you had to go to the other side so the guy in the right back corner could see it, and then you step forward. A lot of people just do it to the center referee. So,
Yeah.
And now, of course, we have all 5 center referees for the most part in front. And so there's been numerous through the decades now. I mean, God, it makes me feel old, you know, because I'm just a young dude.
Well, it just,
But
you know, it's sadly, it's just we're spending more time doing that than actually doing
well,
executing the form. I mean, Lord and mercy,
well,
come on.
I've seen people reverse long four when you're doing the hand isolations back in the back towards 6 o'clock. They've got it to where they turn it around so you're facing the referee in front. So they think, well, it's better that way because he can see it, you know. And I'm going, okay, well, that's changing the form somewhat, but I get what they're doing. Okay, but it's not the actual correct form. Well, I can't hate to see 20 years from now, that's going to be the set form, I think. That's the only
Right.
way it's going to be remembered, you know.
I'm going to go to Lee on this one. Lee, there was something brought up. I came up short one, long one, short two, long two, short three, long three, 4, 5, and obviously 6. When did short 4 come into being? And I think you had a hand in that.
No, I didn't.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Oh, no. Short four was just something that I remember Mr. Park saying, well, you know, you can do that. And if you want to, you do this. And the prescription was you did the first side of protecting fans, and then you did the, you know, first, and you went right to left of the alternate techniques.
Yeah.
Short up. And just for fun, what I did is said, if there's a short four, there's got to be an extension four. So I would run the techniques with the full techniques, the whole thing, the unfurling crane, the ending to destructive kneel, flashing wings, and so on, just for fun. Because, you know,
You actually added the extensions.
Yes.
Oh my God, this thing is going forever.
Yeah, it did go on for, but that was because I get bored easy. I don't have a long attention span. I got to do something to stay entertained. But
Well, that's in similar. That's where I created the secret Kenpo forms. And what those are simply are.
Is that minus the line? I want to know.
No, yeah, only the head guy knows where that line goes because he's going to hold it back. No, but what I call the secret Kenpo forms are all the yellow belt techniques, as an example, are put together in a form, and they all fit together. Orange belt techniques all together in a form. Purple belt techniques all together in a form. So because a lot of time, I mean, we can remember forms real easy, but if you go back and say, hey, Mr. Wedlake, gee, what's the 5th technique of second brown?
Right.
I couldn't tell you. You know, it's like, I don't know. I have to go look at the chart. But if you have a form that's done, so I created these forms as an option. They're just an option. They're not for testing. You know, you don't have to learn them if you really don't want to. You could do left and right. You don't have to. And I think the extension form is, you know, adding the extensions is also a very, I think, unique thing
Yeah,
to add to
I can
those
see
things
both
as
value
well.
to both of these propositions.
The
It's just a
problem
lot
that
of
I have,
material.
and the problem that is posed by doing that, and again, that's why I make them options, just like Lee does. I'm sure he doesn't force them to learn
No.
the extension forms. They're just an option, but because, and the reason we don't do that, at least I don't do it, and maybe Lee will agree, that we have so much material as it is,
Yeah.
we don't need to keep compounding more and more and more material, you know, like the Tracy system, which I believe has 700 techniques or something now. So I talked to Mr. Parker about that, and it's like you spend your whole life memorizing new techniques when actually they're basically just rearrangements of something. You can only do
Sure,
so many new things. And
sure.
so learning that much material is basically just to have it to sell, you know, so you want to keep people there for business.
A couple more questions before we wrap. This is important. Obviously, as I said before, I came up with 32 techniques per belt. Presently, there's always been this evasive question. Mr. Parker restructured the system. What is the correct structure, the last that you remember, of the techniques per belt? In other words, did it go from 32 to 24 to 16 to 12? Your opinion, gentlemen. You were there. You would know better than most.
Well, I came up like Dennis. We had the 10 yellows and we had the 32s. And then it was chopped down to 24 and not resequenced. In other words, like you took technique number 25 from orange, that became technique number 1 for purple, and the material moved up. And then there were the techniques from the forms that were put into the curriculum, and that's what were the Jim Mitchell manuals. So then you had twirling hammers with an extension and so on. And these became the new requirements back in the mid 80s. As far as 16s and 12s and all that, I mean, Brian Duffy gets credit for creating a 16 technique curriculum that was aimed toward juniors. Then there's a discussion about, was it approved, was it not approved? It doesn't really matter, because once Ed Parker passed away, everybody did everything. Everybody made their own curriculum. And one thing that Ed Parker told myself and Steve White up in Steve's office in Manchester, New Hampshire, he says, I'm not going to tell you what you have to do. He says, you have to run your school the way you need to run it to put bread on the table. So if you have to do less or more, you do what you got to do. As long as you understand the principles of the techniques, you're good to go.
So you're basically going to cover the material no matter what. It's just how the size of the portion, basically.
Yes, I would agree with that analysis.
Dennis, what are your thoughts on the reorganization of the techniques?
You know, it started, you know, way back with nothing, and then when the Tracy's broke away, that's when he put together the 32 technique syllabuses, because he didn't want to have the same techniques basically them. So he recreated them, renamed them, and went to 32. Well, then in 78 or 9, he came out with the 24 technique syllabus, and that kind of became the, and that's what was published in the Infinite Insights. In 1988-89, Brian came up with the 16-20-24 system, because in Texas, you know, we were front end loaded too much, as he would see, you know, in the lower belts. So he basically didn't change anything. There was no techniques deleted or anything or changed. It was just moved up. Instead of stopping at 3rd black, it went 2 more belts up to 5th black. And so it had the same amount of techniques. It just changed it to not front end load the lower end from orange to green. And then the second brown, when those techniques are stretched out, there were 16 techniques that were missing. And so he had to put 16 techniques in, which one technique came from short 3 or long 3, and then the 4, 5, and 6 had some techniques put into that chart to fill in those gaps right there. And then on up to the on Brian's thing, the orange, purple, blue, and green are 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th black, and they're the 24 techniques extensions. They haven't changed. That's all those are. So they just merely pushed up. So Mr. Parker gave them to me. He said, try it out. Brian did it, gave it to Sepulveda and a couple other people to try out. And from what he told me and others, and Edmund Jr. and some other people, is I think today, if he were alive the last 30 years, I believe that system would have been available. As Lee said, I don't think he would have made anybody do it. I think it would have been a choice to the studio owner. Would you like to do the 32? Do you want to do the 24? Do you want to do this 16, 20, 24? I don't care. It's all Kenpo. You got to do, you know, his basic premise was principles, concepts, and form, footwork, foot maneuvers, and stances. Those were his key elements, you know, crispness, sharpness, articulation.
Nice thing about the 16 that I really liked was that the first 5 or first 7 are the same on each belt as you go up.
They follow the web of knowledge.
Exactly, in which that reinforces a lot to the educational side for the student, which can throw you into book 5, and you can look into that. One last point, and maybe we might not get too deep on this because of where it is. Obviously, Mr. Parker's background was in judo, jiu-jitsu, Western boxing, and then street fighting, basically in Hawaii. But why is it that we've sort of ignored, and this goes to you, Lee, why have we sort of ignored a little bit of the jiu-jitsu side of our training?
I spoke with him about that because, you know, we had both started in judo and boxing. And his answer to me was, I don't want to have both of my hands tied up. So you can see why he wouldn't do a technique and then slide his arms in there and go for a hip throw. He just was not, he didn't think that was a good place to be in. But then you look at some of the techniques, like the handshake techniques, you have both hands tied up.
Mm-hmm.
And the other man's got a free hand, but we've got the angles of cancellation are all taken care of, and so on. So he wanted to preserve, apparently wanted to preserve that stand-up jiu-jitsu in there with the joint locking manipulations, and, you know, and so on, but didn't want to go down the road with the variety of throws that could have been incorporated, which would have made us look a lot like some of the Kaji Kenpo variations and so on.
Well, we actually have a lot of jujitsu in there, like squatting sacrifice, spiraling twig, you know, several others, you know, that we
Crossing
have
talon.
both hands tied up. So
yeah, and so on. Yeah, there's a lot of that, but there's no let's put both hands on, pick him up, and throw him over your shoulder, which could
So
easily
basic, our basic response, though, if you notice, is that it's some kind of counter movement to nullify, cancel, redirect that guy's energy while we strike. Am I correct?
Yeah.
well, the closest one to that would be sleeper, where you actually do put both hands up and you actually, you know, throw him. But Mr. Parker kind of angled more, rather than throwing over the hip and bringing him up and over and way over and down. He'd rather buckle the legs. He liked to buckle the legs and get them down because it went down faster and you freed your hands up quicker.
Frank was good about that. He would like to use the sweeps mostly. He like a sweep rather than try to throw you. He'd take you down. That was always his signature at the very end of a technique. If you watch him, he would literally do that. My question is why, Lee, did you ever train with Wally J?
I did not. Never had the opportunity to meet him.
How about you, Dennis? Did you train with Wally J?
I wouldn't say train with him, but I had the time to actually talk with him a little bit, you know. And of course, when I met him, I shook his hand, and of course, then he marched me around the room for 5 minutes, you know, because he does this cute little thing where he does this, you know, jujitsu on you, and you can't get out of it. And he's shaking your hand, and he's walking you around, and it was comical. It was great, you know, as well as a little bit of painful, you know. But what a wonderful man. I miss Wally. He was at Mr. Parker's funeral. I was putting up chairs, and next thing I look over and I go, Mr. J, what are you doing? He goes, oh, I'm folding chairs. I say, sir, you don't need to do that. We'll do that. He goes, hey, Ed Parker was my friend too. And I went, wow, what a man. Oh, very classy.
Let me ask this a direction question for either of you, and I'll go first with Lee. Lee, sometimes we're engaged in a conflict with an individual, but we don't want to rip out his eyes or break his shin or collapse his throat. Would it behoove us to use something less lethal, thus the use of some kind of wrist locks, finger locks, some kind of jiu-jitsu movement that could be incorporated in our Kenpo?
Yes, and I think that's the point of learning a lot of those locks that we have incorporated into the techniques. And Mr. Parker always told us with the 8 considerations of combat, you know, and the things that we can do with techniques is rearrange, alter, delete, insert, regulate, and so on. And this is all tied into situational awareness, what we call the totality of the situation in the security business. And you have to have that, you know, because the argument is that, well, your Kenpo guys are programmed to just destroy somebody. You know, they grab your lapel and you break their arms and poke their eyeballs out. And there's a legality that goes along with there's morals, there's ethics, the whole thing. But situational awareness is part of what helps to defend you against those sort of things in a number of ways. And one is to say, let's take enough time to do this move and see what else we need to do, if anything.
Well, you're in law enforcement, so you're not, you have to worry about your employer saying liability, liability, liability. You know, we're going to get sued. And that's been the common practice of personal injury attorneys, you know, over, you know, I guess, abuse of power, you know, where you're in a confrontation. But then again, let's move it away from law enforcement. Let's say we're dealing with children, and Edmund, Jr. has addressed this a bit. Do we really want to teach a child to rip out some other child's eyes or break the shin? And most of that gets into some kind of grappling or rolling around on the ground. So wouldn't it be more behooving for us to show that as an alternative? I mean, we know how to engage. If we're going to engage, we're going to get it on, as Mr. Parker would say. How would you address that issue?
Well, when I was teaching children over the years, I had a commercial school for over 30 years. I would take out a lot of the claws and the eye shots and the breaks and all that and turn them into restraining holds, buckles, takedowns, and so on, so that these kids aren't out there and doing those things that you mentioned. And so you had a children's version of a technique, and sometimes these kids would get older, and as kids do, they lose interest, and then they come back. So you've got a 20-year-old that says, well, I learned everything. You go, yeah, but you got the kids version. And so that was my solution back then to that, was just to take out the really devastating stuff.
Dennis, your thoughts?
Well, I think Evan's hitting on it really well. I think the factual stuff that he's doing has got a place, eventually, somewhere. And what sells, as Mr. Parker said, there's always opposites and reverses. And, we're devastating with our moves for the most part, to start with, all the eye gouging and throwing and stomping and ripping out and breaking the necks and arms and legs and everything else. Well, then there's the opposite to that, which is the peaceful way to go and a more tolerant way to go, in particular for kids and for schools. Schools are not going to be big on having somebody, poke to the eyes in a third grade situation. That's not going to be really appeasing, particularly with today with the lawsuits and everything. So, and with law enforcement, I think same thing. We need to, be careful what we do. But of course, I take my hat off to Lee. He's the 142nd fastest gun in the West. So, 141 can draw faster than he, but Lee's looking for 143. But
well, the beautiful thing about it, listening to both, what we've done is we've progressed here in this conversation from the history, competition, education, now the teaching, and the evolution of Ed Parker Kenpo. I think Mr. Parker would be very pleased to hear your responses from both of you gentlemen as first generation black belts under him, learning directly from him and understanding his general premise of principles of motion. I think it's important because it is truly the evolution of our art. If you look at where it came from the islands of Hawaii, and you look at Chow and Emperado and then Honolulu Sega and all, I mean, these guys used to get down. They would just beat the living crap out of each other on the streets because that's what it was there. I mean, and this was also techniques and a system of warfare coming along Sun Tzu and Miyamoto Musashi. You think about that, but in the modern day, we have to evolve. We've grown. What is your thought, Lee, on the idea of the techniques? I've heard it once before. Why do we teach these techniques? They're irrelevant. We should be teaching something more current.
I disagree, but I do, and I have taught people that, we're like a big corporation where we've got our sales, which are, people that are getting people into the karate schools. We've got marketing, and we've got to have a research and development segment. And so Ed Parker did that when he said, look, when you create a thesis form, you need to build the techniques and prove that they can work. And so these things were, the argument is like, well, nobody holds a handgun like this. Nobody, well, they do. They do it all the time. And a lot of people do it with both hands, and other people turn it upside down. You need to work in these situations. Ed Parker addressed it as a what if. And what Paul Dye does is he has his guys invent a technique, and when they do this, then that technique gets absorbed into his system, and it is transmitted down through teaching, becomes part of the requirements. That's a great idea. So these guys that are saying this stuff doesn't work, well, a lot of these techniques that we do are old classical techniques that have worked for 1,000 years or more.
So they're based on foundation.
Yeah, you got to have them. And, you know, you want to go back and like traditional Okinawan systems don't do this and that because they didn't have handguns. Well, they have techniques for handguns now. They didn't on Okinawa 500 years ago or more, but they developed these things, and we need to develop our art as well as keeping the core.
Dennis, we focus too much on television entertainment, watching the MMM fighting? You know, they're in the octagon fighting. You know, and we think that is the ultimate because they're pounding the crap out of each other. But really, is that realistic?
I think there's some very interesting study of that. I mean, like the Superman punch and yeah, I mean, just various things. You got to remember though, this is a game, and it still has a referee, and there's only one person coming at you, and you're in an enclosed environment, and you're in an environment with no tables, chairs, glass, pitchers, wet floor or anything else around. So it's got its tremendous limitations. When you look at the raw material that the guys have, there's some great moves there that they actually do. But again, all their stuff, they are matching power to power. So now it's actually the gloves are minimal. There's nothing on their legs or shins, and they can actually attack those. So it's kind of about as real as gladiatorial as you can get for modern day, without actually breaking somebody's arm, which I have seen arms and legs broken in there, not intentionally, but somebody gets you in an arm bar and you go too far, and next thing you know, snap, and that thing actually breaks it. Man, it's creepy looking.
I will bet that if you go to Lee and you talk to Lee, he's going to say right off the bat, the difference between us and that is called rules. Rules. Am I wrong? They have rules. You can't, there's only one person they're fighting. If it doesn't fit, somebody jumps in. You get into a situation when you look at the 8 considerations, Dennis says, oh, I grab that table or that chair and whack the guy in the head because there's 3 other guys coming at me. Right. And you're always looking for that. You're not going to see that in the ring. And besides, that's entertainment. So I'm going to end with one last question with this, and it's open up, and you can explore this for me, Lee. What is the future of Kenpo? What is the future of your Kenpo, and what is your legacy going to be?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I've spent my entire adult life studying the martial arts and learning the Ed Parker system and transmitting it. And I want it to be understood and well executed so that it can be passed down, and that his memory and his contributions to our art and the arts in general are remembered and respected for what he did. He's one of the stars in the constellation of famous martial artists, as was mentioned earlier. So I want people to understand it as best they can. It's one of the reasons I wrote what I did, because I wanted them to complement what Ed Parker had written. And so it doesn't become something that I'd seen in other systems where they start making up stories about the founder. I said, oh, we don't know what happened to him. What was he like as a man? It was one of the other books that I wrote was Lessons with Ed Parker. So I wanted people to understand what he was like, not just what he taught. Because if you can understand, I get some sort of an understanding of what his mentality was, you can understand his art better. And that's what this is all about, is understanding what you're doing so that you can apply it effectively.
What is your legacy going to be?
Oh, I'm just going to be the creepy old guy in the corner, I guess.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Uncle Lethal? No, he's not going to be the creepy guy in the corner. Dennis, your thoughts. What is the future of Kenpo? What is Mr. Parker's legacy going to be? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think if Lee and I are successful and people like us that really care about what Ed Parker really taught and his true legacy and his true ideologies, and followed the curriculum that he has, and that doesn't mean that you never learn anything, you never expand anything. When I use the words variable expansion or 8 considerations or any of that kind of stuff, it opens it up to millions of sources. You got the equation formula, and that alone gives you, millions of variables that you can do off of the basic. And the reason what I use to verify that is we have an alphabet of 26 letters. When's the last time those letters were changed? Not in any of our lifetimes. They've been that way forever, right? But how many words have changed, or words have got redefined? For example, the word web. When I was a kid, in the 60s, late 50s, web was a spider web. That was it. You say web today, and nobody even thinks of a spider web. They typically think of the internet, And so there's another word that was added. The 26 letters haven't changed. The basics to Kenpo haven't changed. What changes is the variables and the way we can do things, and the way we can adapt things, and the way we can understand. You get the 8 considerations with environment. People need to study more about the environment in, on, and around you. Range, position, maneuvers. You start talking about range, you got zones. So if they really study the system and open it up, they're going to open up all these volumes and all these chapters that most people don't do. Everybody's locked into doing the technique sequences, and that's it for the most part.
I have to say, you gentlemen are about as close as we're going to get to talking to Ed Parker. You have direct contact with the man. You spent time with him regarding formulation of thoughts, the evolution of Kenpo discussion. I am hard pressed for anybody to say not to spend quality time talking to either of you, or in Mr. Wedlake's case, reading some of these books. They're so insightful. It's about education. I mean, nobody knows it all, but I'll tell you right now, at least you're in the right direction to find something out. And honestly, I would like to see you guys collaborate on doing something together more, because the one thing we don't control is time. And right now is the only moment we have. And I think that is to the benefit of the Kenpo community. I think your words collectively will bring the community back together. And those that don't get it will just not going to get it. Okay, they're not, because they are being hard pressed on change, and change is inevitable. And to borrow a line from Albert Einstein, energy is never destroyed, it just changes form. And that is what Kenpo is. Kenpo is ever evolving, and that energy that you both possess, as it was imparted on you by Ed Parker, needs to be listened to, understood, and revisited, so that future generations of Kenpoists will say, I know what Mr. Parker was like. I spoke to Dennis Knatzer. I know who Ed Parker is because I read Lee Wedlake's books. I had the chance to be in a seminar with them, and that moment is now. And so that's the purpose of the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame. And to borrow your line,
Ancora Impero.
Mr. Wedlake, I defer to you. In other words, I'm still learning. Okay, you're going to teach me how to say it right. So anyway, I'm really grateful that you both could come on. I would like you both to come back again, and next time we can talk about going into infinite insights and beyond. I really think that is a great subject, and boy, oh boy, I think people out there will really love to hear it. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you,
and
Paul.
I wish you all the very best, and I look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Let's do it again.
I'd like to close with one thing. I'd like to close with one thing. I'm going to talk for Lee here, if I may, and I think both of us will agree. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, but both of us will agree. We're not the message; we're the messengers.
Yeah.
And that's what that's the way I feel, and I think Lee feels the same way.
Yep.
Thank you.
Salute.